Alright, so I've decided to take on the task of explaining the Peikoff-Kelley debate, which started with an article by Peter Schwartz. In 1989 he wrote an article entitled On Sanctioning the Sanctioners, and in it he was critical of people who are well known to be objectivists, but who under the auspices of a libertarian organization go and give a speech about objectivism. Shortly thereafter, one of the people about whom Schwartz was speaking, and that was David Kelley, who was well known in objectivist circles, wrote a responding article. The article is entitled A Question of Sanction. Now in that article, Kelley makes four main points. The first is the idea that there are levels or degrees of viciousness, and that libertarians should not be considered as vicious as, for example, communists. Kelley refers to this as a sense of proportion, having a sense of proportion. Now what really was the essence of the Peikoff-Kelley debate was the second point made by Kelley, and that was that although actions can be judged to be good or to be evil, ideas themselves cannot. Kelley's third point, which was related to the second point, was that tolerance is a virtue in the cognitive realm, even if it's not a virtue in the realm of action. And fourth, and finally, he made, in passing, a statement that objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, is not a closed system, but rather a way to integrate ideas, and that we should be open to changes and modifications and corrections and etc. when describing Ayn Rand's philosophy. Now Leonard Peikoff is a professor of philosophy who met Ayn Rand when he was quite young, and who knew her for probably most of his life, was very close with her, and upon Ayn Rand's death, Ayn Rand gave, the intellectual property in her books, in her publications, to Leonard Peikoff. And in that sense, he is her intellectual heir, her legal heir. But he is also, in some senses, her intellectual heir in a philosophical sense, that he, among all of the people remaining on Earth who knew Ayn Rand, spent the most time with her, discussed her ideas more than anyone else, etc. And in fact, he's the author of the one book that in great depth integrates and describes her philosophy. The name of that book is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. And that title is very carefully chosen to equate objectivism with Ayn Rand's philosophy. Now, Peikoff takes aim primarily at Kelley's assertion that ideas cannot be judged to be evil or to be good, that only actions can be judged to be good or to be evil. Peikoff reminds us of Ayn Rand's philosophy, that part of it which says that every fact of reality implies an ought, a thing that you ought to do. Which isn't to say there's only one thing you ought to do given any fact of reality, but in any given context, the facts of reality, combined with your knowledge of what is your highest value, in other words your life, and your purpose, that is your own personal happiness, those things together will determine your course of action, your ought. Now on this point, Peikoff's explanation of Rand's philosophy is that the good is a species of the true. In other words, a fact of reality implies something that is good, and a falsehood implies something that is not, something that is evil. The reason is that the true allows a person to achieve values, and that the false does not. In fact, acting on the false ultimately leads to destruction most of the time. And so to say that something is true is to say that it is ultimately good because it will lead to values. To say that something is false is to say that it is ultimately evil because it will lead to destruction. Now in Ayn Rand's philosophy, as Peikoff explains, we praise the good or reward the good, and we do not reward the evil. In fact, we withhold reward from the evil. This, in fact, is the essence of Ayn Rand's most famous novel, Atlas Shrugged. Now, Peikoff, of course, agrees with Kelley that in Ayn Rand's philosophy, actions are judged to be good or to be evil. But he explains that the only reason that we judge actions to be good or to be evil is because of the ideas or value judgments that lead to those actions. If there were, a mindless entity were doing actions without thinking about them, we wouldn't condemn the actions as good or evil any more than we would condemn the actions of a rat as good or evil. Good and evil are things that are values that we assign to human decisions, human value judgments, human ideas. Peikoff explains that ideas and value judgments that follow from rational thought are those that ultimately lead to the creation of values, in other words, to the good, and that irrational or non-thought evasion leads not to value, but to the lack of value or even to destruction. And those things, destruction, we would consider evil under Rand's philosophy quite clearly. Now, because we're evaluating ultimately ideas, primarily the ideas, as evidenced by action, the action is the evidence of the idea underlying the action that gave rise to the action. Because we're ultimately judging the ideas or the value judgments of the human being, it's not relevant whether, in fact, the person who developed the ideas or idea or who came to that value judgment actually acted on it. The idea or the value judgment is either false or true. If it's true, it's good. If it's false, it's evil. Ideas themselves, value judgments themselves, can be judged. So, for example, Kant had a philosophy full of falsehoods. It's irrelevant that he didn't go out and murder people pursuant to those falsehoods. Obviously, his ideas led other people to act on those falsehoods and to murder many. Hitler, Stalin, etc., ultimately were influenced by Kant's philosophy when they murdered people. That doesn't mean that we only judge Hitler and Stalin. It means we judge those ideas, those value judgments themselves. Kant's ideas, Kant's value judgments themselves, as evil. We judge them to be evil. Because they can't lead to the creation of values, they can only lead to destruction. The evidence of that is that when acted upon by Hitler and by Stalin, we saw the death of millions. But it wasn't simply the death of millions that we judged to be evil. It's the idea that led to the actions that led to the death of millions. Now, what about judging the person who offers ideas or who has made a given value judgment? Well, Peikoff allows for the possibility that some people may be simply in error. But he correctly identifies the fact that, most of the time this is going to be someone who is young, someone who's not yet had an opportunity in life to study their own philosophy, to experience life, but who, when they get older and have understood the facts of reality and do understand life and the needs of their own life and their own purpose better, will vocally and assiduously reject their former conduct, their former ideas, their former beliefs, their former value judgments. But he gives no quarter to those people who ultimately are leading or advocating movements or ideas that are ultimately evil, destructive, can lead to nothing but destruction. It's simply not feasible that Kant didn't know what he was talking about when he proposed the ideas he proposed, when he proposed the system of moral valuation that he proposed. He knew quite well what he was doing. Similarly, Peikoff does not accept the idea that Hitler was simply uneducated, or that he could have been persuaded to be more rational. He quite realistically says no, that the Hitlers and the other organizational leaders of the world who promote irrational philosophies, who promote irrational movements, who suggest that people ought to engage in irrational modes of thought or irrational behavior, those people know what they're doing. They're not simply in error. They might be delusional, they might be acting quite knowledgeably, but either way, they are to be judged as evil. Now, to Kelley's third point, toleration, Peikoff explains ultimately that to tolerate what is evil, to tolerate what is false, and therefore evil, is ultimately to tolerate that which is anti-life. And tolerating that which is anti-life is completely contrary to Ayn Rand's philosophy, which says you do not tolerate that which is false, that which is evil, that which leads to death, that which leads to destruction. So tolerance is not a virtue, whether in the cognitive realm or in the realm of action. Ultimately, and this is getting a bit abstract, but Peikoff explains that by tolerating evil ideas, by not judging ideas as good or evil, Kelley is tearing fact from value. He's tearing cognition from evaluation. He's tearing the mind from the body. All of these things are completely contrary to Rand's philosophy. And he explains, and I think quite rightly, that ultimately what Kelley is advocating is a form or an expression of subjectivism. Don't judge. It's best not to judge. We shouldn't judge other people's ideas. We should only react when they, become violent. It's that sort of hippie attitude that we tolerate all value judgments, all ethical systems, that all we ever condemn is violence, or otherwise conduct that we don't like, but that we don't criticize or judge anyone's ethical system as good or evil, better or worse. Now, in response to Kelley's submission that Ayn Rand's philosophy is not a closed system, that's merely a means of integrating ideas, Peikoff says, no, it's a closed system. Ayn Rand's philosophy is Ayn Rand's philosophy. Objectivism is objectivism. Objectivism is the word that is used to refer to Ayn Rand's philosophy. Therefore, that which is Ayn Rand's philosophy is objectivism, and that which is a modification of, or a correction of, or an addition to, or subtraction from Ayn Rand's philosophy is not objectivism. Call it what you will, but don't call it objectivism. Now finally, Peter Schwartz wrote an addendum to Peikoff's essay, Fact and Value. The essence of Schwartz's addendum is that justice requires denying any sanction, any moral respectability to that which is evil. Libertarianism is founded on this idea that we can get together a whole bunch of people around this political concept of liberty, and we need not care about why people like liberty. We need not care what their ethics is, what their epistemology is, what their metaphysics is. We'll just all get together because we all like liberty. And we don't particularly care what your philosophy is as long as you love liberty, as long as you think you love liberty. And we're not even going to get into, how you define liberty. If you say you love liberty, then good enough for us. You're a libertarian. All you have to do is agree that, you won't initiate a course of physical force against anybody else, and we don't care whether you believe that there's a heaven or whether there is no heaven. We don't care whether you believe that you can obtain knowledge by divine revelation or whether it can only be obtained through rational inquiry. We don't care whether you're an altruist or whether you're selfish.
The guiltiest men today are not the collectivists. The guiltiest men are those who, lacking the courage to challenge mysticism and altruism, attempt to bypass the issues of reason and morality, and attempt to defend the only rational and moral system in mankind's history, capitalism, on any grounds other than rational and moral.
The essence of his essay is that moral conduct, ethical conduct, requires us to deny any kind of moral sanction, any act or deed which would make evil look to be good, to reward it with any kind of unearned moral status or moral value. He explains that there was an event going on at the time in Iran, a book fair. Now this was a regime that was prone to censorship, and they were holding this book fair, in all honesty, to make it look as though they were open to ideas and open to, discussion on a wide variety of ideas. We see this even today, where people claim to be open to new ideas, but in fact, if you say anything that's negative about Islam or about Muhammad, well, that's off limits. You're not allowed to speak about that. Well, in Iran they were having this book fair. And clearly the purpose of the book fair was to make it look as though Iran was a place in which freedom of speech was a given, and that people were free to say what they wanted to say, and that it was a place for wide-ranging and divergent intellectual discussions. And so Iran had invited several Western book publishers to come and participate in this book fair. Well, of course, by doing so, the victims of censorship, the book publishers, were sanctioning the Iranian government. They were giving it the badge of respectability in participating in an Iranian book fair. The Western publishers were making it look as though Iran was a place which was protecting free speech, which was in favor of open dialogue, which didn't care about offensive speech, which was of course false. Okay, so the victim was sanctioning, ultimately, the conduct of Iran, which was pro-censorship. By participating in the book fair, they made it look as though this pro-censorship government was not pro-censorship, but was rather pro-freedom of speech. Ultimately, he concludes not that you shouldn't speak to libertarians, but that if you're trying to explain to libertarians that the only proper basis for capitalism, the only proper justification for capitalism is moral and rational and reality-based, then you don't do that within the context of an event hosted by a libertarian organization, or an organization well known to be associated with libertarianism.
What benefit does an advocate of reality, reason, and rational self-interest confer on a libertarian organization when doing a speech about freedom in front of a group of libertarians hosted by a libertarian organization? Well, consider what happened to Hank Rearden in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged after he signed over to the state all property concerning his new invention, Rearden Metal. Consider how the state used that quote-unquote gift to make representations about Hank Rearden's moral commitments, Hank Rearden's moral sanction of the state's ethical code. You have heard Hank Rearden denounced in the past as a reactionary who opposed every step, measure, slogan, and promise of the present system. Now you hear him praised as our greatest industrialist, whose judgment on the value of economic policies may safely be trusted. You have heard him fighting for his rights, his and yours, for his independence, for his property, yet he did not fight Directive 10-289. He signed voluntarily, you have been told, the gift certificate that surrendered Rearden Metal to his enemies. He signed the one paper which, by all of his previous record, you had expected him to fight to the death. What could this mean, you have constantly been told, unless it meant that even he recognized the necessity of Directive 10-289 and sacrificed his personal interests for the sake of the country. Judge his views by the motive of that action, you have constantly been told. Dagny Taggart addressing the nation on radio in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
I hope that helps. If you've got any questions about the Peikoff-Kelley debate, post them and I'll try and answer in a follow-up video.